Let me now transition over to Eric Schmidt, as I mentioned, the former CEO of Google, and he's been doing just a ton of interesting work. Eric, it's always so good to see you, and thank you for joining us, if only virtually. There are a lot of topics we can touch on. One that I know you and I talked about a little bit was just the way these technologies have the potential to have just really big effects. People used to talk about billion-dollar ideas, but you were telling me about $100 billion ideas or trillion-dollar ideas. What are some of the game changers that you see on the horizon that you'd like people who are listening now maybe think more about?
Well, let me suggest that chemistry is due for a redo, because we understand quantum chemistry a little bit. We understand how things combine together in chemicals. But we don't understand them well enough to be able to simulate them accurately. The rules are incomputable by current computing standards. And until we have quantum computers, we won't be able to break through. And yet the AI techniques that you know of are likely to produce extraordinary new insights into chemistry. Let's think about drugs.
Yeah.
Halocene, which is a new drug out of MIT with a collaboration where they had biologists and they had drug experts and they had computer scientists rethinking the way they looked at the information choice space for the combination of the various proteins that put these drugs together. So those are the things which are where they're stuck because of some rule, right? Some physics rule. And AI can break that through are probably the biggest ones in terms of sheer impact.
And this is like protein folding, for instance, where the combinatorics are so large, you're not going to just brute force your way to testing every possible combination. You need to have some insights about how the chemistry works.
Yeah, so my description is, what do all of these people in these drug companies do? Here's what I think. They wake up in the morning and they have an idea, they have a lab and they try it out. And at the end of the day, in the lab, it doesn't work. So they go home, beat the dog or whatever it is, in frustration, sorry for the metaphor. They don't beat the dog. No. But the important point is they're really upset. They go to sleep. The next morning, they have a new idea and then they try it for the day. And they do this day after day until they hit big shot. How can we get that to be faster? And I think the best way to do it is to be able to do these virtual simulations. And again, it's very grounded in the facts that are known in the case. So these databases that are getting, essentially these biobanks that are being put together are going to be the basis for example, of an explosion in synthetic biology. So I'm very excited about the fundamental shifts that will occur that the average person here won't see it, because all you'll see is in additive manufacturing, the thing will get just that much smarter, that much better, that much stronger. The combination of materials will produce a better material for your future car and things like that.
Yeah, we only explored a tiny fraction of the ways you can combine different elements and atoms together to create new compounds.
So everybody wants to talk about the really sexy stuff, which includes things like GPT-3 and the ability to have conversational AI and so forth. But the journeyman gains will be in the application of these techniques to existing hard problems by existing smart people who add AI to it.
And how quickly do you see these things happening? Have you already seen people doing some of what you're describing, or is this something that's a decade away or somewhere in between?
I've been funding these in my own philanthropy because I'm so interested in it. And I'll give you an example. David Baker's lab in Seattle did a whole bunch of protein, essentially think of it as protein work. But what they're really doing is doing the basics of how biology works. And they were able to model new reagents, new interactions, and so forth that nobody thought would happen. So I can just give you example after example. There are probably some other ones that should be on the list. I'm interested in the question of learning engineering. You and I have talked before. Why is learning so slow in terms of its automation? Why do we not know how people learn? And if we had enough data, maybe we could build algorithms that would be learning and inference algorithms could actually produce defined better outcomes, right? So we could actually prove that this approach for this category of student of whatever type is better. So it strikes me that that's a high one. In terms of the government, there are obvious uses of this in national security, cyber war, those kinds of stuff, which I think are all obvious. But there's something much more pedestrian, which is fraud. The financial systems are full of pattern matching opportunities. I'm thinking of Medicare fraud. You did a paper on this 5 years ago where you took everybody through this. You had a funny example of how this worked out. But the point is that stuff is trivial for modern computing. The software exists, all you have to do it. And the payback is, a few days of work.
But isn't this, just like you mentioned the defense case, but in fraud as well, isn't this going to be adversarial? I mean, the bad guys have access to comparable technologies too, or do they?
There's always a smart guy as your adversary, and there's an awful lot of dumb guys. And so if we could just eliminate all the dumb guys, and then we'll figure out a special team to work on the smart guys, we're not doing anything, is my point. My point is that low level, I'll just use the word low level fraud, which is not done by the Osama bin Laden equivalents, the really, really shrewd and evil people. We can find those people and we can stop it, and we can get the money. Things like, I don't know, pick another boring thing, tax returns, tax planning, same argument. Over and over again, when you look at large systems of humans, AI can basically make the experience more efficient, more precise, more targeted. In China, it can also be used to oppress people. That's not going to happen in the US because of our laws. So don't take my comment as endorsing that. The fact that you can do it doesn't mean you should do it, but the technology enables this.
Well, that was an encouraging thing. You said it's not going to happen in America. I don't know if everybody is equally confident. Say more about why you're confident that these technologies won't end up getting abused by governments. And that's one of the reasons some people are hesitant to have them implemented, and including some of the folks at Google.
Well, in terms of being brutally honest, our government is not competent in implementing these things. And so smart people, like people watching this, have this notion that, oh, the government could take this database and combine it with this base, and then they could take the rights away of this group, and then so forth. The government can't even find the first database. So I don't worry at the moment about this. It's a theoretical worry. I worry much more about the fact that we're spending a great deal of money in our country pursuing solutions that are not at the state of the art, because we don't have enough software people in the government and in these systems. And I'm the chairman of this thing called the AI Commission. And the majority of our recommendations are about getting more technically competent people into the monopoly parts of our world, the government.
Well, yeah, that's a big gap, and you've done a lot to try to bridge that gap, and you invited me to participate in some of those. Say a little bit more about what it's been like moving between the world of Silicon Valley and Google, which is by all accounts filled with a lot of very smart people who are doing amazing technological things, and people in government that maybe don't have access to some of those tools and some of those people. And how are you bridging that gap, and how far is that a gap that can be bridged?
I think it can be. The people are quite good, and the tools are terrible, and the systems are from the Stone Ages. So this is sort of a volition problem. We know how to solve this. We have models that succeed in the private sector. We're just choosing not to implement them in our government for whatever reason. And the one big difference in the government is it's so hierarchical. So the only way change happens in any of these departments is if the most senior person makes it a priority and has somebody reporting to them whose job is to make it happen. Otherwise, the bureaucracy just perpetuates itself. It's a simple law of bureaucracies. So we've been pushing very hard for all parts of the government to add the equivalent of an AI emerging tech person, right? So every single one of the national functions has the opportunity to take advantage of these technologies and also to be hurt by the application of these technologies against them. So let's pick the Russian interference in the election. The Russian interference, by all accounts, appears to have been manual. In other words, being done by humans. But if you were to automate it, it would become a much more serious threat. Do we have the people and the teams and so forth to deal with an automated attack of misinformation? I don't know the answer. But
you don't know the answer?
I don't know the answer, and if I did, I probably couldn't say it because it would presumably be classified. But I honestly don't know the answer. But my point is, we've got to get to the point where we can say, in something as fundamental as the integrity of our elections and our information space, that it's not being illegally interfered with.
You know, it's not a law of nature that Google was a nimble, innovative company. It's in part due to your leadership there during that period. And you've written a number of books. One of my favorite is How Google Works, where you describe some of the processes there, with the hope, I think, that other people could learn some of the things. For instance, the hiring not done by a single manager, but by a set of peers, a little bit like we try to do it in academia. two-part question. First, say a little bit about, how transferable some of those processes at Google are to other companies and the rest of the economy. But then the other side of it is, now that you're gone, looking back, are there some things that you think you would have done differently, or didn't work out, or for that matter, are obsolete now, and you think that we need to go beyond what Google used to do?
Well, when I go back to my service to the company, which was over a 19-year period, the biggest mistake that I made of all was the issue around social media. And we did not collectively understand social media. I did not act quickly enough. We had all the components, but we didn't act. We did a lot of other things right, which I'm very proud of. So I guess that's my defense. But the fact of the matter is, the social media and its impact on our society is just beginning. If you take a look, for example, at the impact that social media has had on the way people learn, the way they communicate, the way they form their political opinions, the way they form their social class, it's just beginning. So I think that's sort of the statement of where the interesting choices are. And so now we're in a situation where we have TikTok, which is taking over the country by storm, and we don't control it, and we don't like that, which is exactly what we did to Europe when we were Americans and we took over Europe using the social media for the same reasons. So it works both ways. With respect to other companies and hiring, one of the things to remember is that, ignoring the pandemic for the moment, most companies turn over 5 to 10% of their people every year. And so people will say, well, we can't make this change because we're not hiring anybody. And I said, that's not true. You may not be growing, but you are in fact hiring a lot of new people. And so if you just implemented sane rules like hire for competence, have multiple people look at the offers, try to avoid hiring glue people who don't add any value, but they're very nice, prioritize the hard work, know what the objectives are. There's just a set of lists that's kind of sensible, and focus on strategic flexibility as opposed to experience. And I think companies can change. Now, what happens is, because they don't do what I'm suggesting, they create a digital division. The digital division is subject to the same rules as the normal company. So the digital division never gets the good people because it doesn't feel right. And you end up with sort of a bad transition. So I think the correct thing for the leaders who are watching this to do is to say, we're going to make software be a priority throughout our entire company. We're going to put software functions and software knowledge, and software, I mean broadly, software technology innovation. And we're going to have plans for every one of our division. We're going to have protected budgets. We're going to allow people to hire the people they need, and we're going to use modern hiring principles. Plus, we're going to move to the cloud, things that you've talked about a long time. Imagine a scenario where every company decided in 1 year to become an AI-based cloud company for its services. Think about how the economic benefit to them in terms of lower costs and better design. Let's talk about advanced manufacturing, something I've started working
on that point just briefly. So I've talked to some CEOs of big companies and small companies. One of the pushback is, well, sure, Google or a number of other companies, they're special, that they're doing things differently. It's not going to work at Joe's Pizzeria, or maybe not even at Walmart. How widespread do you think this approach should be or could be in the economy?
So this belief is offered without any proof. And there's plenty of examples of existing companies that have managed to build digital organizations that become center of their e-commerce. And so if you look, imagine if e-commerce didn't exist. The vast majority of the companies that are still around got through the last 6 months because they had revenue on their e-commerce site, and they started doing business in Asia because their US and European retail were shut down. Let me give you another example to make the point. Advanced manufacturing, something I've gotten very interested in. It's now possible, roughly speaking, to do software design of every hardware piece you're doing, and then using various forms of 3D manufacturing that are very complicated to build prototypes that work the first time. This is a game changer for manufacturing. But as a software person, I think of it as a software problem, right? In other words, you have to get the software to work, you have to get the cloud systems, you have to get the internal systems and build. And this argument of somehow Google is hiring all the smart people, trust me, the #1 major at Stanford is computer science. The #1 major at MIT is computer science. The #1 major at all the Ivy League schools is computer science. In the vast majority of the universities in America, we are producing that incredibly smart people, people who would be in physics and math and the really, really crazy stuff, too hard for me to do, they're all now in computer science, right? So that is the seed corn of a great success. So if we could just get through the current leadership, the current stupid policies in our country, the pandemic, and let these people build these industries, it's going to be incredible. You've spent a lot of time in your economic work. You understand the power of this, right? So you probably yourself can model this better than I can.
Well, I'm excited like you are about the potential for making the pie a lot bigger and for revolutionizing these industries. That's one of the reasons we created the Digital Economy Lab. The other side of it is that we don't always have the equity and inclusion that we'd like to have. And a lot of people are left behind. Not everyone is a computer science major at Ivy League schools or anywhere. And what are your thoughts on how we can achieve that vision while also supporting equity and inclusion?
Well, one of the problems we have with AI is this stuff is really, really hard. And so you have to have not only a technical degree, but you have to be very good in math. And so the equity inclusion issue tends to reflect the hidden biases and the other things which are preventing minorities and so forth from getting in those areas. I just reviewed a study that was from University of Massachusetts, where Black teenage girls were being told, don't go for the AP math test. And the equivalent white teenage girl was told, go for the AP math test.
Really?
Right?
Just like by their high school counselors?
Yeah, and it's one of those kind of biases that, you won't make it, whereas the white counterpart is, and that's horrific. That has to get fixed. It's not fair to anyone. It's not the way our society should work. But coming back to this, I'm reasonably convinced that this invasion of smart people, that if you in running your company can actually make that happen, you'll be just fine, right? Think about it. The pandemic has accelerated the digital economy to the point where your customers are online and the sales calls are on Zoom, right? Furthermore, you can build everything in the cloud, and you can do so while you're sitting in your rural ranch in Montana, if that's where you want to shelter. The pandemic's going to go on for at least another year, right? Given the various problems we had, failures from our government, et cetera, et cetera. So we might as well get organized around taking advantage of all that.
Well, you pointed out the failures in our government a couple of times now. So let me ask more directly about how is technology impacting the way government runs? How is it impacting democracy?
Well, there's the aforementioned issues around social media, specifically to Facebook. And this problem in Facebook, of course, is you opt into people who have the same beliefs as you. So let's just admit that there is a filtering problem and that there's an echo chamber problem with some of the social media. And it is, in fact, a problem. It has to be addressed in one way or the other, either through voluntary action or regulatory action. You've got to believe it's going to come, because you can't run it.
It's a serious problem. I remember actually literally in the late 1990s, Marshall Van Alstyne and I wrote about this filter echo chamber effect, because there was a newspaper at the Media Lab called the Freshman Fish Wrap, which was where you only saw stories that you were interested in, which sounded like a good idea. But as you can imagine, it led to a lot of sort of groupthink and reinforcing of existing prejudices. That was just a little sort of experiment, but you could see even then that if you turbocharge the ability of people to filter out stuff they didn't want to see, it could lead to some very pernicious effects.
Yeah, it's also the politics of outrage. So what happens is you get somebody in a bubble and they see something which they think is outrageous, they pass it along to their friends uncritically. So there are multiple solutions to this, but let's pen that. I think the question that's more important than the question you just asked is the question of, is democracy in its current form and the internet and society compatible? In other words, as we build this next generation of systems, will the autocratic systems, which have solved some of the crazy problems at a huge cost of freedom, will they ultimately produce societies that are growing and where the well-being is higher? Whereas the democracies suffer from poor leadership, instantaneous polling, specialized networks, all sorts of weird tactics like that. And it ultimately sets back the consensus that built our modern democracies. And I worry about that, as many other people do. There are so many ways in which this technology could be used to make people smarter, right? To give people more tools to be more intelligent in what they do. I'm an optimist because I fundamentally believe that what we're trying to do is we're trying to make people more intelligent. We're giving them tools to know things that they would never know on their own. We're giving them far better educations by the time this is over. That has to be good. It has to be good to have people be better educated, more sophisticated, more worldly, with a greater understanding of what's going on in the whole world as well as in their local domain.
Well, we've got a bunch of questions online. Let me try to get to some of those. And let me pick one that draws on the theme you're just talking about. What role do you think democratic government has in regulating the collection and exploitation of personal data? Does GDPR go too far, not enough? And you've touched on some of the other countries.
I may have the counter view of everyone else. My experience at Stanford and certainly at HAI is everyone's extremely concerned about personal data. In my experience, most normal people are not concerned about personal data. They're concerned with getting the thing to work. And so to me, the concern about personal data can be addressed by various forms of regulation. The GDPR, by the way, had the property that it made everyone happy, but it also made, because the regulatory burdens were so high, it had the unintended impact of making it harder for European firms to compete with American ones, because the American funds already had the engineers and the lawyers and so forth and so on. So it's tricky to get this regulation right. So what you want is big tech is important, and there's no question it's impactful, and there's no question it should operate under law. And everyone wants light regulation, but no one can agree on what light regulation is. And then you have situations such as the antitrust trial, which has just been announced against Google, which I guess will go on for a decade. And by the time it goes on for a decade, at the end, it'll be a new set of issues. So you have a hammer in the form of antitrust, which is maybe too big. And then you have a scalpel, which has maybe got the wrong direction on it in some of these areas. We have not collectively found the way to manage these in such a way that the various interests are balanced.
Well, let me build on this. So there's some questions on that, and cognizant that you may have limitations on everything you're able to say on that. But the question is, would a successful U.S. antitrust ruling help or hinder the future of work? Is big tech becoming dangerously monopolistic?
Well, first place, I'm not constrained from speaking. I'm no longer a Google employee. I'm not on the board. I am a shareholder. So I can actually answer your question.
Good.
And the answer is that I want to start by saying I want to thank big tech for getting us through the pandemic.
Absolutely.
I used Amazon a lot, and I'm grateful that Amazon added 100,000 employees to service my inane and stupid requests, right? It made my life better, and they obviously
almost everyone's lives better. No, that's been, we have a lot of problems with the pandemic, but one of the big successes has been the way tech, Zoom, Amazon, Slack, Google, email.
Let's thank Google. Let's thank Apple. Let's thank the infrastructure. Let's thank the telcos who responded to the demand. These are demands that went up by a factor of 10, and they didn't keel over. Try that in your supermarket, right? All the stores would be empty. So let's start with, I want to start by saying, let's get our act right. Second observation I would make is that our primary competitor is China, and that anything we do to limit or regulate the key tech companies should be done in such a way to understand that the global competitor is China. And I don't want to see the hobbling of that. With respect to this.
Let me push back on that a little. The theory of antitrust is to increase vibrancy, competition. I mean, one of the reasons Google came about was because it was able to, as a startup once upon a time, compete against some much bigger companies.
So the problem I have, you're repeating the 1932 Sherman Amendment, Second Amendment.
The Sherman Antitrust Act. That's the theory of antitrust.
Yeah, and I think the fact that it's been used so seldom indicates that it's problematic. If you look at the IBM antitrust case, the Microsoft case. So again, my comment would be, if you want to regulate tech, try to regulate it, right? Actually try to write down what you want, right? Rather than letting the courts and that. I'd much rather say, let's have the conversation. Let's have the trade-off of your privacy and the government's right to access to data. That's a reasonable debate in a democracy, but let's have it explicitly. Mm-hmm. So on the specifics of the Google trial, of the Google claims, it has to do with the Apple search deal, which I view as an arm's length normal deal. So again, I'm not sure I completely agree with the argument.
Well, what the press is saying, I don't know if you can say anything different, is that Google's been paying north of $10 billion a year for that, and without that, maybe Google would come out ahead if they were constrained from having to pay that anymore.
I think Google would be quite happy to pay less. You know, that price was set not by Apple, but not by Google, but by Apple, right? Apple wanted more money. You see what I'm saying? This is an arm's length deal between two large companies. I think you're better off taking the position that I've taken, which is I worked very hard in 1997 against Microsoft in the antitrust case. And the key thing that was true in 1997 was there was one platform, which was Windows, and there was one path for distribution, which is on top of Windows. And the core decisions of the judge at the time had to do with basically were the APIs a proprietary lock-in. We worked very, very hard at Google to make sure that we had multiple choices at each of things. And the company has since given a response, which basically points out and gives examples of your choice as a user. And that's, I presume, going to be their defense.
Let me loop back to what you said just a few minutes ago about China. And China wanted Google to filter its results or censor its results, and you didn't comply and were kicked out, or I would say you, Google didn't comply and was kicked out, as were most other American tech companies. Are we seeing two internets? Is that the future? And now the converse of that, of course, is the United States is constraining or affecting the way some of the Chinese companies can operate in the United States.
So if you look at there's language and there's strategy and there's what actually happened. So in the last 2 years, you've had the Huawei issues, which are significant, including the changes recently that do not allow the use of semiconductor equipment from America to be used to manufacture the chips for Huawei, which is a material impact on Huawei. Plus you have TikTok, where the US president goes in and basically forces a deal, which essentially switches the cloud provider of TikTok from Google to Oracle, where TikTok owns the majority of the US subsidiary. Those are historic events in the sense that they are the first time, to my knowledge, where the US has both fought something coming in and also banned the use of something like that going out. And in those sense, the tactics are similar to what China did to us, 10 years ago. So I suppose in that sense, there's a certain amount of symmetry. My concern here is that we're in the process of decoupling the internets, and as the more decoupled they are, the less likely they are to come back. And let me give an example. The Android restrictions, we're not allowed to give Android to China, and the ARM restrictions, China's not allowed to use the ARM platform. So the Chinese are intelligent, they have lots of money, they're full of smart people. So what are they going to do? They're going to build their own platforms, their own chips, and so forth. Now that's 40% of the market today. So you've just injured the big tech companies, which maybe is your goal if that's your strategy, but I think it's bad for America. It's certainly bad for shareholders, because the big tech is $5 or $6 trillion of valuation in a $30 trillion market.
Yeah.
So it has a material effect to the wealth of our American citizens and certainly to their retirement accounts. But anyway, the important thing is we're busy. All the tools we have to fight China are ones which cause us to separate. We don't have good tools now which keep us safe and keep us empowered, but also allow us to work with them. And until we fix that, it's a bad news situation, because as we split, it gets harder and harder to put back together.
Well, Eric, this is a fascinating topic. I'm dying to ask you a few more questions, but I'm being warned here that we're already over time. And maybe we can continue this conversation in private sometime or have you back again. But thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing some of your insights with you and the work you're doing at Schmidt Ventures and helping the government and so forth. I'm very grateful you could join us today.
Well, thank you. And in addition to being a very good friend and probably the first chronicler of what the digital economy would be, your move to Stanford, the creation of this lab, is one of the great things that's happened in the last 12 months. So congratulations for all of that.
Well, thank you for those kind words. And let me thank also all the people who have joined today for the launch of the Digital Economy Lab. I also want to thank the people who have been helping out to make this possible, including Fei Li and John Etchemande, who are co-directors of HI, and Mark Duggan, the CEPR director, who have helped make the Digital Economy Lab possible. Of course, Christy Coe, you heard from, the executive director. There's a whole bunch of people who have been working hard behind the scenes, including Celia Clark, Ronnie Shamar, Sean Hatchie, and others. Too many to mention, in fact. But let me just leave you with some closing thoughts. I hope we've helped shed some light on how AI is reshaping work and some of the big issues that we're facing. There's no guarantee that AI or any technologies are automatically going to benefit most people. Technology does not shape our destiny. We shape our destiny. And if we want to create a world that matches our values, we have to take action now to determine what the future will hold. We can all help shape the future, whether we're executives or line workers, whether we're educators or students, whether we're policymakers or citizens and voters. And with a very consequential election coming up, our role as voters is especially salient just now. So please do your part to help make the world a better place, and please stay in touch with us at digitaleconomy.stanford.edu. Thank you very much, and goodbye.